In the mighty kingdom of Persia, ruled by King Xerxes, a grand palace stood tall and shining in the city of Susa. The king, known for his power and wealth, decided to host a royal celebration unlike any other. He called for a feast that would last a full 180 days, a show of wealth and glory for all the nobles and officials across his vast empire. Gold and silver couches lined the walls. Curtains of fine linen hung from marble pillars. Perhaps she felt humiliated, or perhaps she had grown tired of being treated as something to display. Whatever the reason, her answer was firm. His pride had been hurt in front of all his guests. He consulted with his wise men, who knew the laws and customs of the kingdom. They told him that the queen's behavior would set a bad example. If word spread that she had disobeyed the king, other wives might begin to refuse their husbands, creating disorder throughout the empire. She had lost both her father and mother when she was young, and had been raised by her cousin, Mordecai, a kind and wise man. Mordecai warned her not to tell anyone that she was a Jew. He wanted her to be safe, as Jews in Persia were often treated as outsiders. Every day, Mordecai walked near the palace gate to find out how Esther was doing and to hear news of her. More than any other woman, she won his favor and admiration. He placed the royal crown on her head and made her queen in place of Vashti. A grand celebration followed, and Esther was honored above all others. Mordecai loved Esther like his own daughter. She was not only beautiful but also humble, respectful, and strong in character. Every guest drank from goblets of gold, each one unique, and the wine never stopped flowing. Each one had her turn to go before the king. But when Esther's turn came, she asked for nothing extra. She simply trusted the advice of Hagar, who knew what pleased the king. To prevent rebellion, Vashti was removed from her position as queen. He gave her special attention, the best food, 7 personal servants, and moved her to the best part of the women's quarters. Still, she did not speak of her background or her people. Just as Mordecai had instructed, she was never allowed to appear before the king again. A new queen would be chosen in her place. Though their lives had changed, the bond between them remained strong. Beautiful young women from all the provinces were to be brought to the palace. In the shadows of the palace, a threat was rising, but so too was a quiet strength in the heart of a queen who had not yet spoken her full truth. They would be given beauty treatments and prepared for their one meeting with the king. From among them, the king would choose his new queen. The choice to hide her identity would become more important than ever, and the courage she would need had only just begun to grow. After those long months of feasting, the king held another banquet, this time for everyone in the capital, from the greatest to the least. It lasted 7 days, and took place in the garden courtyard of the palace. The king was in high spirits, and decided he would do something bold. He called for his queen Vashti to appear before the guests, wearing her royal crown so they could admire her beauty. But Queen Vashti refused. She did not want to be shown off like a prize. When the king heard her refusal, his joy turned to fury. King Xerxes agreed. But who would it be? A search was ordered across the kingdom. In the city of Susa lived a young Jewish woman named Esther. When the king's order reached their part of the city, Esther was taken to the palace along with many other young women. Inside the palace, Esther found favor with Hegai, the official in charge of the women. For a whole year, the women prepared themselves with oils, perfumes, and spices. When King Xerxes saw Esther, he was struck by her grace and beauty. Mordecai, still keeping watch at the palace gate, continued to care for her from a distance. Yet as Esther settled into life as queen, neither she nor Mordecai could have guessed the danger that would soon threaten their people. The story of Esther was far from over. Esther was now queen, but she never forgot Mordecai, the man who had raised her with love and wisdom. Though she lived inside the palace, surrounded by beauty and splendor, her heart still listened for news from outside. Every day, Mordecai would sit at the king's gate, watching, waiting, and sometimes catching small pieces of information that floated through the whispers of the court. One day, Mordecai overheard two of the king's guards talking in secret. He sent word to Esther immediately, and she brought the news to the king, giving credit to Mordecai for the discovery. The king gave him a high position above all the other nobles. Everyone was ordered to bow before Haman as a sign of honor. People obeyed. When Haman passed by, they lowered themselves to the ground, their heads touching the floor. The matter was investigated, and the story proved true. The two guards were found guilty and punished. When he learned that Mordecai was a Jew, Haman decided to destroy all Jews in the entire kingdom of Persia. The entire event was recorded in the king's official chronicles, a great book where all the important events of the kingdom were written. It is not in your best interest to tolerate them. Do what you think best, he said. But for the moment, Mordecai's loyalty was forgotten by the king. Buried in the pages of that thick book, sackcloth, ashes, and cries of sorrow filled the air. Mordecai tore his clothes, covered himself in ashes, and went into the city, wailing loudly. But he could not enter the king's gate dressed in sackcloth. Their voices were low and angry. These men, Bigthana and Teresh, were among those who watched the entrance to the king's private rooms. He cast lots, called Purim, to choose the day the destruction would begin. She sent a messenger to find out what had happened. Mordecai gave him a copy of the decree and begged Esther to go before the king and plead for her people. The date fell on the 13th day of the 12th month. Still many months away, the palace stood quiet, but inside Esther's heart, a quiet strength was rising. He sent orders to all the provinces, sealed with the king's ring. Her heart raced. The fate of her people lay heavy on her shoulders. On that day, every Jew, young and old, men, women, and children, was to be killed and their possessions taken. But something had turned their hearts bitter. Mordecai leaned in closer, careful not to be seen. What he heard made his blood turn cold. They were plotting to kill King Xerxes. Mordecai did not hesitate. There was a strict law in Persia. No one could go to the king without being called. If someone entered the king's presence uninvited, the punishment was death, unless the king extended his golden scepter. Esther had not been summoned in 30 days. Time passed, and a man named Haman rose to great power. Do not eat or drink for 3 days. Night or day, I and my servants will do the same. Then I will go to the king, even though it is against the law. If I perish, I perish. Everyone except Mordecai. If you stay silent now, help will come from another place, but you and your family will perish. Who knows? Perhaps you have come to your royal position for such a time as this. He refused to bow. The king's officials at the gate noticed this and asked Mordecai why he defied the king's command. But Mordecai gave no public answer. Day after day, they pressed him, and finally he told them he was a Jew. The officials told Haman, hoping it would explain Mordecai's behavior. When Haman saw Mordecai stand tall while others bowed, his face darkened with rage. But he didn't want to punish only one man. He went to the king with a sly tongue and hateful heart. There is a people, he said, scattered throughout your kingdom. They follow their own laws, not yours. King Xerxes, trusting Haman, gave him his signet ring, a symbol of royal power. Haman wasted no time. Panic spread as the letters were read aloud. Mourning filled the streets of every city. In Susa, people wept openly. Inside the palace, Esther heard that Mordecai was in distress. Esther was troubled. She sent this message back to Mordecai, and his reply struck her deeply. Do not think that because you are in the palace, you will escape." Esther paused. Then she sent a message to Mordecai. "Gather all the Jews in Susa. Fast for me." Mordecai did just as she asked, and so, for 3 days, the people prayed and fasted. Esther was now queen, but she never forgot Mordecai, the man who had raised her with love and wisdom. Though she lived inside the palace, surrounded by beauty and splendor, her heart still listened for news from outside. Every day, Mordecai would sit at the king's gate, watching, waiting, and sometimes catching small pieces of information that floated through the whispers of the court. One day, Mordecai overheard 2 of the king's guards talking in secret. The matter was investigated, and the story proved true. The 2 guards were found guilty and punished. The entire event was recorded in the king's official chronicles, a great book where all the important events of the kingdom were written. But for the moment, Mordecai's loyalty was forgotten by the king. Buried in the pages of that thick book, their voices were low and angry. These men, Bigzana and Teresh, were among those who watched the entrance to the king's private rooms. The king gave him a high position, above all the other nobles. Everyone was ordered to bow before Haman as a sign of honor. People obeyed. When Haman passed by, they lowered themselves to the ground, their heads touching the floor. It is not in your best interest to tolerate them, but something had turned their hearts bitter. Mordecai leaned in closer, careful not to be seen. What he heard made his blood turn cold. "Do what you think best," he said. They were plotting to kill King Xerxes. He cast lots, called Purim, to choose the day the destruction would begin. The date fell on the 13th day of the 12th month, still many months away. He sent orders to all the provinces, sealed with the king's ring. There was a strict law in Persia. No one could go to the king without being called. If someone entered the king's presence uninvited, the punishment was death, unless the king extended his golden scepter. Esther had not been summoned in 30 days. On that day, every Jew, young and old, men, women, and children, was to be killed and their possessions taken. The palace stood quiet, but inside Esther's heart, a quiet strength was rising. Mordecai did not hesitate. He sent word to Esther immediately, and she brought the news to the king, giving credit to Mordecai for the discovery. Sackcloth, ashes, and cries of sorrow filled the air. She sent a messenger to find out what had happened. "Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my servants will do the same. Then I will go to the king, even though it is against the law. If I perish, I perish." Mordecai gave him a copy of the decree and begged Esther to go before the king and plead for her people. Mordecai tore his clothes, covered himself in ashes, and went into the city, wailing loudly. But he could not enter the king's gate dressed in sackcloth. Day after day, they pressed him, and finally he told them he was a Jew. When he learned that Mordecai was a Jew, Haman decided to destroy all Jews in the entire kingdom of Persia. The officials told Haman, hoping it would explain Mordecai's behavior. Time passed, and a man named Haman rose to great power. "If you stay silent now, help will come from another place, but you and your family will perish." Her heart raced. The fate of her people lay heavy on her shoulders. Who knows, perhaps you have come to your royal position for such a time as this. Everyone except Mordecai, he refused to bow. The king's officials at the gate noticed this and asked Mordecai why he defied the king's command. But Mordecai gave no public answer. When Haman saw Mordecai stand tall while others bowed, his face darkened with rage. But he didn't want to punish only one man. He went to the king with a sly tongue and hateful heart. "There is a people," he said, "scattered throughout your kingdom. They follow their own laws, not yours." King Xerxes, trusting Haman, gave him his signet ring, a symbol of royal power. Haman wasted no time. panic spread as the letters were read aloud. Mourning filled the streets of every city. In Susa, people wept openly. Inside the palace, Esther heard that Mordecai was in distress. Esther was troubled. She sent this message back to Mordecai, and his reply struck her deeply. "Do not think that because you are in the palace, you will escape." Esther paused. Then she sent a message to Mordecai. "Gather all the Jews in Susa. Fast for me." Mordecai did just as she asked, and so, for 3 days, the people prayed and fasted. Esther stood once more in her royal chambers, hands folded tightly as she watched the horizon burn gold with morning light. The second banquet was ready, the tables set with the finest dishes and wine. Yet her heart beat with steady dread. This time she would speak. This time there would be no turning back. Even up to half the kingdom it will be granted. As the sun climbed the sky, King Xerxes and Haman arrived in high spirits. Her voice trembled at first, but her eyes were steady. "If I have found favor in your eyes, O king, and if it pleases your majesty, grant me my life, this is my petition, and spare my people, this is my request." The feast was laid before them, and the king was eager to hear what Esther would finally request. His color drained. He looked to the queen, then to the king. He had not expected this. He had come to enjoy a feast. Now he stood exposed, his evil made known. A gallows 50 cubits high stands beside Haman's house. He had it built for Mordecai, who once saved the king. He leaned forward and said again, "Queen Esther, what is your petition? It will be given to you. What is your request?" The edict Haman had written to destroy the Jews was still law. In Persia, once a royal decree was sealed, it could not be undone. Esther wept before the king once more. Esther took a breath. "Write what seems best to you." The very gallows he had prepared for Mordecai became his end. Who is he? Where is the man who has dared to do such a thing? He saw Haman falling upon the couch where Esther reclined and shouted, "Will he even assault the queen while she is in my house?" The king's smile faded. "Your life? What do you mean?" The people of Susa celebrated with joy. Wherever the decree reached, the Jews rejoiced with feasts and gladness. An adversary and enemy, this vile Haman. "If we had been sold merely as slaves, I would have remained silent, though that would still be a burden too heavy. But this is a matter of death." He wrote in the name of the king and sealed it. The new decree allowed the Jews in every province to gather and defend themselves. They could protect their lives, families, and homes from any who sought to harm them. Couriers rode out with the news, spreading hope where once there was only fear. Esther continued, "For I and my people have been sold to be destroyed, killed, and annihilated." King Xerxes' face darkened. He rose from his seat, rage flashing in his eyes. He begged for his life. They had seen justice done. They had witnessed the downfall of evil and the rise of the humble. "Please, Queen Esther, have mercy." Esther turned her gaze toward the man beside her. Would the king's decree be enough? Haman froze. Xerxes, furious, stormed out into the palace gardens to calm his wrath. Haman, in a panic, fell at Esther's feet. But before he could say more, the king returned. As soon as the words left the king's mouth, the guards covered Haman's face. Then one of the eunuchs, Harbona, spoke. Xerxes turned to him and said, "Hang him on it." So they took Haman and led him away. Peace returned to the palace, but the danger was not yet over. "If it pleases your majesty," she pleaded, "and if I have found favor in your sight, let an order be written to overrule the dispatches that Haman devised to destroy the Jews in all the provinces." King Xerxes extended his golden scepter again. Esther rose. The king said to both Esther and Mordecai, who now stood in Haman's place, "You may write another decree in the king's name on behalf of the Jews." So Mordecai took the king's signet ring and quickly set about drafting a new edict. Mordecai, now dressed in royal garments of blue and white, left the palace with a golden crown and a robe of fine linen and purple. The day of their destruction had become a day of salvation. Even some of the people in the empire who were not Jews began to honor the God of Esther and Mordecai. But the day of conflict was still to come. Would the Jews be able to stand against their enemies? Esther's courage had opened the door, but the people would now need strength to walk through it. The 13th day of the 12th month, the day appointed for the destruction of the Jews, finally arrived, but instead of a day of fear, it had become a day of determination. Across all 127 provinces of King Xerxes' empire, the Jewish people stood ready. They did not hide. They gathered together in every city, prepared to defend their lives and families. And just as Mordecai's decree had allowed, they fought back. In Susa, the capital, the enemies of the Jews rose up, still hoping to carry out Haman's evil plan. In the provinces, 75,000 of their enemies were defeated, but the Jews took no plunder. They did not fight for gain, only to defend their lives. But they were not prepared for the strength and unity of those they had once thought weak. The Jews overcame them with courage and faith. The letters reminded the people to give gifts to one another and to the poor, to feast and rejoice, and never forget how close they had come to destruction or how powerfully they had been saved. Their names were recorded, a sign that evil had been fully rooted out. Yet despite the victory, Esther came once again before the king. They told the story again and again, how a young woman rose to bravery, how a faithful man stood with quiet strength, how enemies fell, and how hope triumphed. Mordecai was second only to King Xerxes himself. He worked for the good of his people, seeking peace and prosperity for all. She wanted every generation to remember the courage it took to speak up, the power of unity in the face of fear, and the truth that God watches over his people. And let the bodies of Haman's sons be displayed as a warning. It became a reminder of how fragile life can be and how quickly evil can rise. They heard of Mordecai's wisdom and steadfastness. They learned how, though they were scattered throughout the empire, they had not been forgotten by God. And what did she leave behind as her legacy? The story of Esther taught that silence in the face of wrong can be dangerous, but even one voice, when raised at the right time, can change everything. And yet, the final chapter of her story would reveal even more. Her eyes were filled with a deep concern. What had been a day of planned destruction became a celebration of deliverance. Laughter returned to the streets. Children played without fear. Families gave thanks together. They read the scroll of Esther aloud. Each time Haman's name was spoken, the children would make noise with rattles and drums, shouting to drown out his memory. And when they heard the name of Esther or Mordecai, they cheered. With Mordecai now honored and respected throughout the empire, many officials, governors, and royal administrators helped the Jews, knowing that justice was on their side. In Susa alone, 500 enemies were defeated, including the 10 sons of Haman. "If it pleases the king," she said, "let the Jews in Susa be allowed to carry out this day's victory tomorrow as well." The king agreed. The order was given, and so, on the next day, the Jews in Susa gathered once more and overcame more of their attackers. They declared that these 2 days should become a yearly festival, days of joy, rest, and remembrance. They called it Purim, named after the lot or pur that Haman had cast to choose the day of destruction. What he had meant for evil, God had turned for good. As the sun set and peace returned, a deep joy spread among the Jewish people. Mordecai and Esther saw what had happened and knew it should never be forgotten. Mordecai sent letters to all the Jews throughout the empire, encouraging them to celebrate Purim every year on the 14th and 15th days of the 12th month. Queen Esther too wrote with royal authority, confirming Mordecai's instructions. And so, each year, the Jewish people remembered. Esther and Mordecai continued to serve faithfully in the king's court. But even with peace in the land, the memory of that near destruction lingered. Children grew up hearing how Queen Esther stood before the king, risking her life for her people. And every year, when the festival of Purim came around, the people dressed in bright colors. The festival became a time of joy, of courage remembered, and of thankfulness passed from one generation to the next. But even though the danger had passed, the story was far from over. What had Esther learned through it all? How had she changed? The queen who once trembled behind palace doors had become a symbol of strength and faith. The days following the Jews' deliverance were filled with relief, but also reflection. Esther, now known not just as queen but as a savior of her people, carried a different kind of weight upon her shoulders. As the new second-in-command under King Xerxes, he used his position not for wealth or power, but for justice. His heart remained with the people, and his leadership helped heal the empire after the fear and unrest stirred by Haman's evil plan. Her bravery had changed the course of history. Yet Esther didn't boast or seek reward. Instead, she spent her days quietly watching the people rejoice in their newfound freedom and safety. Mordecai remained at her side, offering counsel and guiding the kingdom's affairs with wisdom. Though peace had been restored, Esther often sat at her window overlooking the streets of Susa, watching the families who passed by. She smiled when she saw children playing, remembering what it meant to grow up as an orphan herself. What if they forget that I was once afraid, that I didn't know what to say or do? She had never imagined her life would be used to save others. One evening, as the sky turned shades of gold and pink, Esther turned to Mordecai. God doesn't ask us to be fearless. He asks us to be faithful. Mothers told their daughters the story of Esther. Fathers reminded their sons of Mordecai's faith. Year after year, the story spread beyond Susa, beyond Persia, across deserts and seas, through generations of Jewish families and communities. Servants smiled with pride. They knew the queen had risked everything for something greater than herself. And not just because of Purim. Together, they reminded the people that the strength of a nation did not come from armies or gold, but from the righteousness of its leaders. Though he ruled a vast empire, he had never met anyone like her. Her kindness softened his pride. Her honesty stirred his conscience. She remained in his heart, not as a decoration of the throne, but as a light in his court. Do you think they will remember? She asked. I wasn't strong on my own. I fasted, I prayed. A young orphan had become a queen. But more than that, she had become a symbol of courage. Her story reminded the world that when we trust in God and speak when the moment comes, we too can change the course of history. Children were laughing outside, waving little flags for the festival of Purim. The scroll of her story was being read in the synagogue down the street. The girl who had faced a king, knowing she might die. The girl who had spoken up, knowing it was the right thing to do. She could almost hear the cheers for Mordecai, the rattles that sounded at Haman's name, and the bright voices praising God for deliverance. And still, I trembled. Mordecai tilted his head. That's exactly why they'll remember. Because you didn't let fear stop you. But memories fade, Esther said. Mordecai's eyes softened. Esther looked down at her hands. And still, you spoke, Mordecai replied. Those words stayed with Esther. She realized that her story wasn't just about saving a people. It was about being brave enough to act, even when courage seemed small. It was about trusting God when his plan was unclear. She invited young women from the palace and city to visit her. They listened as she told them her story, not as a queen in fine robes, but as a girl who had once hidden her identity and feared she would never be enough. She made it her mission to teach this lesson to others. "You don't have to be royalty to be brave," she would say. "You only need a willing heart." Some of the girls who listened grew up to teach others. Even King Xerxes came to admire Esther, not just as his queen, but as a woman of rare strength. When she walked through the palace halls, guards stood taller. Esther continued to work quietly behind the scenes, ensuring justice remained a priority in the kingdom. She and Mordecai became symbols of peace. Years passed, but Esther's light never faded. One morning, she stood once more by the window. Tears filled her eyes, not from sadness, but from joy. She remembered the girl she had once been, the girl chosen for a crown she hadn't wanted. Esther turned to Mordecai, who now walked slower with age. "They remember," she whispered. He smiled. "Yes, and they always will." Esther's legacy wasn't just carved into royal records. It was alive in the hearts of the people. The decree of destruction had been reversed. The Jews across the vast Persian Empire had not only been spared, but had triumphed over those who sought to harm them. And now, a new tradition was born, one that would be remembered for generations. In each scroll was the command to celebrate the days of victory with joy and thanksgiving. These days would be called Purim, named after the lot that Haman had cast to decide the date of the Jews' destruction. It began with joy, but not the kind that shouts and boasts. It was quiet at first, spreading from one household to another. Families lit candles, gathered around tables, and shared stories of courage. Now, she wore it with purpose. She remained queen, but she chose to live humbly. On Purim, she didn't hold a grand banquet for nobles alone. But Esther wasn't there to be admired. She was there to remind them of something deeper. But bravery lives in all of us. In every mother who protects her child, let these days be remembered and celebrated in every generation. The scroll of Esther, called the Megillah, was read aloud in synagogues. Families gathered to bake sweet pastries called hamontashen, shaped like the enemy's hat, reminding them that even the worst plans can be undone by God's hand. Not just as a time of laughter, but as a time to look back and see what God has done. Let it teach your children that faith and courage are stronger than hatred. In every man who stands for truth. In every child who chooses kindness over fear. Instead, she invited children, elders, widows, and strangers. She walked among them, hearing their laughter, their songs, and their blessings. The people she had saved carried her name in songs and prayers. And every year, when Purim returned, the world remembered the queen who chose to speak when silence would have been easier. They recited the tale of how God had used an unlikely queen and a faithful guardian to turn sorrow into celebration. What was meant for harm became a mark of deliverance. Esther and Mordecai, understanding the importance of remembrance, sent letters throughout the No one was forgotten. No one was left out. The entire community rejoiced together. But God had overturned it. But I prayed, and I remembered that even when we are afraid, we can still do what is right. But when the time came, I knew I could not stay silent. In that moment, Esther knew her story had truly taken root not just in books or traditions, but in the hearts of those who would carry it forward. You were worth the risk. You were worth the prayer. And God was faithful. Esther had been hesitant when she first wore the crown. In every city, from the smallest village to the grand gates of Susa, the people feasted, shared food with neighbors, and gave gifts to the poor. Esther stood before the people, no longer hidden, no longer silent. Her voice rang clear, filled with gratitude. I was afraid once, she told them. I was just a girl, unsure of her place in the world. The crowd listened in awe. Many had never seen a queen speak so openly from the heart. You may think I'm different from you because of this crown, she said. Mordecai followed her words with his own, urging the people never to forget Over time, Purim became a season of storytelling. Children dressed as Esther, Mordecai, and even Haman, rattling noisemakers whenever Haman's name was mentioned. Though Esther never fought with swords or rode into battle, her actions were celebrated with just as much honor. Her courage had saved a nation. As the years passed, Esther grew older and her steps slowed, but her legacy remained strong. The palace walls echoed with her story. One evening, long after the sun had set and lanterns glowed across the city, a little girl climbed onto Esther's lap. "Are you really the queen who saved us?" the girl asked, wide-eyed. Esther smiled. "I am. Were you scared?" "Yes," Esther said softly. The little girl nodded, then rested her head against Esther's shoulder. And so, the story of Esther, the brave queen who trusted in God, risked her life, and saved her people was not forgotten. It was lived.